Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Bookmark, where I review or give you some insight about a book that I've read in recent times which I recommend to you. Tonight's book is a larger tome. It's called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and its subtitle is The Lies That Divide Us. And just to give you an indication of Isabel Wilkerson, she's a Nobel Prize winning author. Her previous book, which was a bestseller, and she writes about the issues of race relations in North America, but also elsewhere. This book has become very quickly within the last year an enormously impressive and helpful indication, not just of race relations, which people would say would be the original sin of the USA, going back to the times of slavery and all the turmoil ever since. It was the precipitating cause for the Civil War, after all. But she actually looks at race through the prism of what she calls caste. Some people pronounce it caste, Caste, caste. And the caste system is when people find themselves in different hierarchies, in groups and out groups. And if you're in the in group, that's fine. You're probably at the top of the tree, at the top of the hierarchy. But as the system works its way down, you find yourself pushed to the margins if you're one of the undesirables or the untouchables. And I mention the untouchables because what she does is not just to look at race relations or the issue of caste, how separate races or peoples divide within American society, but she also looks at parallels in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, and also in India. And probably people are most familiar with the caste system in India, which is still a huge part of their way of arranging and living their society. It's a deeply impressive book. It's a large tome. It runs to over 400 pages. A hardback copy that I have here, but I highly recommend it. And if you're looking for one book to try and give you an idea and a handle on race relations and the whole caste system and how that permeates through generations, even centuries, and how it is such a difficult thing to, in a sense, reform or change for the better, this is the book for you. This is the book that has gained a lot of acclaim. She actually starts off in her preface by talking about a man in the crowd, and whilst the bulk of the book is about North America, USA, and race relations, caste relations in America, she actually starts by drawing a parallel from 1936 in Germany, and a man called August Lesmeyer, who is the only person in a black and white photograph at one of Hitler's big rallies. I think it's in Nuremberg, and where everybody else has got their arm up in the Nazi salute, he's the one person who has his arms folded. And he has his arms folded because he is, in a sense, bucking the trend and proving to be the odd man out. He has learnt a bit about the Nazi ideology and some of the sinister practices that most people were naive to and ignorant of at that time in 1936. But he was in love with a Jewish woman, and he already had been on the receiving end of a great deal of hassle and a great deal of intimidation. He's the one person in the crowd who doesn't, in a sense, give in to the whole Führer principle, the notion that Hitler was the Führer or the savior of a reconstructed Germany and all the racial policies and the caste system that the Nazis were putting in place and which largely hoodwinked most of the nation. We know the outcome and the aftermath of the rise of the Nazis and the Second World War and the Holocaust and all of those horrors. And it's easy to look back and think that we would like to think that we would be on the right side of history as August himself was at the time. But just think how brave you need to be the one person who stands against the tide. It's very easy either to be caught up in that or just to passively go along with the crowd and not kick up any fuss. He didn't, and he and others in different situations proved to be the real heroes and the real prophets, so to speak, in difficult and challenging times. I've been a wee bit pushed this week for a chance to prepare, so I'm just going to give you a very brief gloss of what the book involves. It's an analysis of race relations in India and in Germany, but primarily in the USA, where Isabel Wilkerson herself comes from, lives, and works. Let me give you an indication of the chapter headings. Part 1, toxins in the permafrost and heat rising all round. That's her image of the sinister nature of caste. Part 2, the arbitrary construction of human divisions, because caste and racism are arbitrary things that we introduce and to our great cost. Part 3, which is almost the heart of the book, the 8 pillars of caste. Let me indicate just a few of the pillars of caste that keep the society going. Divine will and the laws of nature, people claiming that God wills there to be a caste system and divisions between races. The control of marriage and mating, purity versus pollution, dehumanization and stigma, terror as enforcement, cruelty as means of control, inherent superiority versus inherent inferiority. All these practices and mindsets and prejudices are passed down from generation to generation. And when you learn these things in the family home, these prejudices, these divisions, this caste system, before you become independent minded, you already have your worldview coloured and even tainted and set in stone by the mindset of those around you, parents, grandparents, family, local community, sometimes sadly church included. So there are lots of factors that shape young lives and tiny minds before people have a chance themselves to make up their own minds. And one of the things that we have realised in recent times, especially the last year or so, and it's come home with fresh force through Black Lives Matter and even the turmoil in which the British royal family now finds itself in, is that it's not simply enough to say that I'm not racist and that I wouldn't do that and I would never perpetuate that. At the level of individual choice, we think that we're free to act properly and fairly and humanely and with a degree of equality. But actually what often happens to those of us from perhaps, say, a particular culture or race or even part of a caste system is that we do not know just how systemic and how deeply structured racism or the caste system or other forms of prejudice really are. And sometimes we need to be challenged by people who see it differently and more importantly have experienced it differently. But also we, in a sense, need to realise that the things that we take for granted are already skewed or tainted in a certain way. And those of us who come from a particular background, perhaps white, perhaps male, perhaps middle class or whatever, we really don't know just how privileged and how we have taken that privilege for granted for generations, probably even for centuries. And you'll know recently that from sporting events, there have been people taking the knee that came from Colin Kaepernick and the American football 2-3 years ago, maybe in the face of Trump's presidency. But that's now filtered into all forms of sport, not least local football, football in the Premiership and England and elsewhere. So these are issues that are not just abstract political issues or cultural issues. These are written and woven into daily life and even the sport and the pastimes that we enjoy. Let me just reference a few more chapter headings just to give you a flavour. The tentacles of caste, how it insinuates itself everywhere. The consequences of caste and the deep cost and suffering for people. Backlash when people begin to push and protest back. And then awakening when people begin to wake up to the realities of not just individual acts of racism or caste, but how systemic it is in the systems and structures that we inherit and often just live with half asleep and then perpetuate and pass on. There's a lot to this book that I could tell you in terms of how she analyses economics and politics and culture and history, as she tells some harrowing tales of people who have suffered at the hands of racism and the caste system, And some of the most poignant stories aren't where people are lynched or put to death or hanged, harrowing though those are. But one or two stories that I find very moving of young, African American or black children who suffered prejudice early on in life from their classmates or their sporting club mates. And there's some very moving, poignant stories that would ring tears from a rock. And if you're not moved by that, I don't know that you'd be moved by very much in life. So there's much more to be said, and I realize I'm only scratching the surface of a wonderful book and an important subject, that of caste, the lies that divide us. But maybe suffice just to allow you to think about getting a hold of or purchasing and reading Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, the Lies That Divide Us. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll meet again next week for Bookmark as I review or recommend another book. In the meantime, God bless.